Carlo Gambino said it out loud, in a room full of the most dangerous men in New York City. After watching Frank Lucas shoot tango in broad daylight in front of 300 people, and then walk back across the street and finish his lunch, Carlo Gambino, boss of the Gambino crime family, the most powerful organized crime figure in the United States, said this: "A man who kills in front of 300 people isn't afraid of anything. We don't do business with crazy. We do business with professionals." That man is both. He called Frank Lucas a professional. He said it to the other 4 bosses of the 5 families. He said it in a private room where things like that are said with the full weight of what they mean in that world. And then every single one of those bosses went back to their territories and their operations and their decades of accumulated power, and did absolutely nothing to stop what Frank Lucas was building, because they had just watched him do the thing that nobody does, the thing that defines the line between the men who last a week in that world and the men who last a decade. They watched him act, without hesitation, in public, in a way that made everyone who saw it understand immediately and permanently who Frank Lucas was. And then they called him a professional and got out of his way. But here is what Carlo Gambino did not know that evening. Here is what none of the 5 families understood when they convened their meeting and passed their verdict and decided that Frank Lucas was a professional worth respecting. The shooting on 116th Street was not the reason Frank Lucas was going to dominate New York's narcotics trade for the next 7 years. It was the announcement. The reason, the actual structural reason, the thing that made the empire possible, the thing that no Italian family and no existing Harlem operator and no competitor of any kind could replicate or undercut or destroy once it was in place, was already built. It had been built in silence in the months before September 12, 1968, in a series of decisions that Frank Lucas made in the wake of Bumpy Johnson's death that nobody outside of a very small circle knew about, and that nobody who understood them could quite believe. Blue magic was already in New York when tango died. The purest product the city had ever seen was already moving through Harlem streets when Frank crossed 116th Street with 4 bullets and a plan. The shooting established who Frank Lucas was. Blue magic established what he had. And what he had was something that Carlo Gambino, for all his decades of power and all his accumulated wisdom about how the narcotics trade worked, could not have produced if he had tried. This is the story of blue magic, not the story of what it was. Every telling of the Frank Lucas legend mentions the product, the purity, the brand, but the story of how it came to exist. The specific decisions Frank made in the weeks after Bumpy Johnson died that produced a supply chain so unprecedented that the D, when they finally understood it years later, described it as the most innovative thing they had ever encountered in narcotics importation. This is the story of the thing that the 5 families called Frank Lucas a professional for, not because of what they saw on 116th Street, but because of what that announcement was announcing. July 1968, Bumpy Johnson is 3 weeks in the ground. Frank Lucas is sitting in his office in Harlem with more clarity about the landscape than almost anyone in the city, because he has spent a decade watching the most intelligent operator in Harlem's history navigate it, and because he has just spent the last hours of that operator's life receiving whatever Bumpy had left to give. The landscape Frank sees is this: Harlem's narcotics trade in 1968 is a system of tributary relationships that flows almost entirely upward to the Italian families. The 5 families control the ports. They control the law enforcement relationships that allow product to move through those ports. They control the political connections that provide protection at the city level. They control, in the most fundamental sense, the supply chain from the point of entry into the United States to the point of distribution at the street level. There is no pathway that does not pass through some arrangement with some Italian family at some point. The black operators who work in Harlem, who actually run the corners, who actually employ the dealers, who actually interface with the customers, are not partners in this system. They are franchisees. They take product at a price set by the families. They move it in territories defined by the families. They generate revenue. It is then taxed by the families at every level. Bumpy Johnson had navigated this system with exceptional skill for 40 years. He had managed the arrangements, maintained the relationships, kept Harlem's operators functioning in a way that preserved a certain degree of autonomy, even within the structural dependency. He had done it because, as he understood and taught Frank, the alternative, direct confrontation with the families, was a war that could not be won. Not by any black operator in New York in 1968, not with the resources available, not against the entrenched institutional advantages the families possessed. So Bumpy navigated. He was brilliant at it, and he taught Frank to navigate too. What he did not, perhaps could not teach. Frank was the thing that Frank figured out in the weeks after Bumpy's death, when he sat with the landscape and looked at it not as something to navigate, but as something to redesign. The dependency on the Italian families was not a fact of nature. It was a fact of logistics. The families controlled the supply chain because they controlled the entry points. They controlled the entry points because they had built relationships with the source, with the producers and distributors in Southeast Asia and the Middle East and wherever else the product originated that no American black operator had been able to access directly. The relationship with the source was the structural advantage. It was not the only thing the families had, but it was the foundational thing. Everything else, the port connections, the law enforcement relationships, the political protection, derived its value from the fact that if you wanted product, you needed the families to get it for you. Frank Lucas sat in his office in July 1968 and asked the question that nobody in Harlem had asked before. At least not with the resources and the network, and the specific knowledge that Frank possessed after a decade at Bumpy Johnson's side. What if you went to the source yourself? Not through a middleman. Not through a connection of a connection. Directly. What if you got on a plane, flew to Southeast Asia, found the people who actually grew and processed the product, and built a relationship with them that had no Italian family in the middle of it? The idea was simple enough to state. The execution was almost impossibly complex. It required the kind of network that Frank Lucas had been building without explicitly knowing he was building it during his years with Bumpy. Connections in Southeast Asia developed through contacts in the military, through diaspora networks, through the specific and unlikely pathways that a decade of operating at the edges of Harlem's underground economy had opened. It required money, which Frank had. It required patience, which Bumpy had spent years teaching him. And it required the specific audacity of a man who looks at a system that has been in place for decades and decides it is not actually immutable, that the thing everyone in his world accepts as a fixed condition is in fact just an arrangement that nobody has yet had the resources and the vision to rearrange. Frank Lucas had all of these things. And in July 1968, 3 weeks after Bumpy Johnson's funeral, he got on a plane to Thailand, not the specific geography of Frank. Lucas's supply chain is something that historians and journalists and federal prosecutors have documented in considerable detail. Because when Frank eventually cooperated with authorities after his 1975 arrest, he was remarkably specific about the operational details of what he had built. The source was in Southeast Asia, Thailand, and through Thai connections into the Golden Triangle, the region where Thailand, Laos, and Burma meet, which in the late 1960s was the most productive opium-growing region in the world and the source of the majority of the heroin that eventually reached American streets. The product that came out of the Golden Triangle at that time, varied enormously in purity, depending on who processed it and how. The standard product that reached New York through the Italian family supply chains after being cut multiple times at multiple points in its journey arrived at somewhere between 30 and 40% purity. This was not because pure product didn't exist. It was because every intermediary in the supply chain cut the product to maximize their margin. And by the time it had passed through 5 or 6 sets of hands between the original processor and the New York street, what had started as something close to pure had been reduced to a fraction of its original quality. Frank understood this. He had been in Harlem long enough to know what the product was, what it could be, and what the difference meant on the street. What he went to Thailand to find was not just a supplier. He went to find a way to bring the product from the source to New York without it passing through the multiple intermediary hands that degraded its quality and extracted tribute at every stage. He found it. The specific contacts Frank established in Thailand, the relationships with producers in the Golden Triangle who had never dealt directly with an American buyer before, who had always sold through intermediaries, were the result of months of careful relationship building that Frank approached with the same patient discipline he applied to everything. He was not the first American to go looking for direct relationships in Southeast Asia. He was the first Black American operator from Harlem to get there with enough money and enough credibility and enough specific knowledge of what the American market needed to make the deal worth making for the people on the other side of it. The product he brought back was 98% pure, not cut, not reduced, not processed through a chain of intermediaries, each taking their margin in purity. 98% pure heroin from the Golden Triangle, brought directly to Harlem through a supply chain that Frank Lucas controlled from one end to the other. He called it Blue Magic. The name was Frank's marketing instinct at work, and Frank Lucas, who is remembered primarily as an operator and a strategist, had a marketer's understanding of brand that most of his contemporaries completely lacked. A product needs a name. A name needs to mean something. Blue Magic meant the purest thing available. It meant the thing that made everything else feel like a substitute. It meant quality so far beyond the existing market that comparison was almost beside the point. And the name spread the way good brand names spread, not through advertising, not through any formal channel, but through the experience of the product itself, through the specific effect that 98% pure heroin produced in a market where 40% had been the ceiling, through the word of the users who tried it and came back specifically asking for it by name and would not accept alternatives. Frank introduced Blue Magic to Harlem's market with the specific care of someone who understands that a superior product still needs to be managed well to realize its full potential. He did not flood the market immediately. He controlled the supply carefully, introduced it through trusted distributors who understood that they were handling something different and needed to handle it accordingly, built the brand recognition before scaling the volume. This was Bumpy Johnson's teaching made operational. The patience to build correctly rather than to build fast. The understanding that the first impression a product makes is the one that lasts. The discipline to resist the temptation to maximize short-term revenue at the cost of long-term market position. Within weeks of Blue Magic's appearance in Harlem, the market was reorganizing itself around it. Dealers who had been moving standard product were calling Frank's people looking for access. Users who had tried it once were asking for it specifically. Competitors who couldn't match the quality were losing customers to it. The economics were straightforward and devastating to anyone trying to compete. Frank's direct supply relationship meant his cost per unit was dramatically lower than anyone who was buying through the Italian family chain. His purity was dramatically higher. This meant he could sell at a price that undercut competitors while maintaining margins that were substantially better than anyone else in the market. This is the structure of a monopoly, and Frank Lucas understood that what he had built was exactly that, not a business in a competitive market, but a position of such structural advantage that competition was effectively impossible for anyone operating within the existing supply chain architecture. You cannot compete with Blue Magic if your product comes through the families, because your product will always be cut more times and priced higher than his. The only way to compete with Frank Lucas was to do what Frank Lucas had done, go to the source directly. And in 1968, in Harlem, nobody else had the network, the money, the knowledge, and the audacity to do that. Frank was operating in a market without real competition, and he knew it. The $1 million a day that Frank Lucas was generating by early 1969 was not the result of exceptional sales effort or superior market penetration in the conventional sense. It was the result of what happens when a product is genuinely and substantially better than anything else, available in a market where the customers care deeply about quality. Blue Magic sold itself. Frank's operational genius was in building and maintaining the supply chain that kept it coming, and in managing the distribution infrastructure that got it to the street without the kind of disruption that would attract the wrong kind of attention. Both of these things required the discipline and the organizational capability that Frank had spent years developing under Bumpy's observation. What the Italian families understood when they convened their meeting after September 12, 1968, was the surface of what Frank Lucas had done. They understood the killing, the public declaration of power, the 300 witnesses and 0 descriptions, the specific message that a man who shoots someone in broad daylight and then finishes his lunch is sending to the world. They understood that message because it was the kind of message they had been sending for decades, and they knew exactly what it meant. What they did not understand, what Carlo Gambino did not understand when he called Frank Lucas a professional, was the deeper thing, the structural thing, the thing that made the public declaration not just a display of personal courage, but the announcement of an economic reality that had already been created. Blue Magic was already in the market when Tango died. The supply chain was already functioning. The brand was already establishing itself. The customers were already learning that there was a new standard, and that anything that wasn't Blue Magic was, by comparison, inferior. Frank Lucas had not just demonstrated that he was willing to do what needed to be done in public. He had built the thing that made the public demonstration necessary, an economic position so strong that it required a corresponding declaration of power to match. The shooting and the supply chain were two halves of the same strategy. One established the political reality, who was in charge in Harlem. The other established the economic reality, what Harlem ran on and who controlled the source of it. Together they created what Frank Lucas had been building toward since July 7, 1968, a position of such complete dominance that the Five Families, the most powerful organized crime organization in the history of the United States, looked at it and decided that the appropriate response was to call him a professional and leave him alone. The irony is exquisite. The families had spent 40 years maintaining their structural advantage in the New York narcotics trade through their control of the supply chain. Frank Lucas had simply gone around the supply chain entirely. He had gone to Thailand, built a direct relationship with the source, and created a product that was so much better than anything the families could provide that their structural advantage became, in the specific market where Frank operated, irrelevant. They still controlled the ports. They still had their law enforcement relationships and their political connections. But Frank was not importing through the ports, or not primarily, and when he eventually developed the Vietnam coffin operation, he was using a transportation channel that the families not only didn't control, but couldn't touch, for political reasons that were entirely beyond their influence. The Five Families were the most powerful force in New York's organized crime landscape. Frank Lucas had identified the one structural weakness in their position, the assumption that nobody would or could go directly to the source, and had exploited it so completely that, by the time they understood what had happened, the damage was irreversible. Blue Magic was in the market. The brand was established. The supply chain was functioning. The customers knew what they wanted and who had it. You cannot unbuild that kind of market position once it exists. The families could have tried to destroy Frank Lucas, could have moved against him in the way they moved against people who threatened their interests. But Carlo Gambino looked at what Frank had built and made a calculation that was, by the standards of his world, entirely rational. A man like that, who had built what Frank Lucas had built, who had demonstrated on 116th Street what he was willing to do to protect it, who had the organization and the resources and the supply chain and the brand. Destroying that man would cost more than accommodating him. So they accommodated him, called him a professional, gave him Harlem, and went back to their territories to manage an empire that had just been made slightly smaller by the existence of a man from North Carolina who had looked at their structural advantage and figured out how to render it irrelevant. Frank Lucas ran Blue Magic from 1968 to 1975. 7 years. $1 million a day at the peak. Over $400 million total by some estimates. The operation employed his brothers, who ran territories across the tri-state area. It employed distributors across Harlem, the Bronx, Brooklyn. It employed, through the corrupt arrangements that Frank maintained with specific officers, a portion of the New York Police Department. It was, by any objective measurement, the most sophisticated and most profitable narcotics operation in the history of the American drug trade up to that point. And it was built on one foundational insight, the insight that Frank Lucas had arrived at while sitting in his office in Harlem in July 1968, 3 weeks after Bumpy Johnson's death, looking at a landscape that everyone else accepted as fixed and asking whether it actually had to be that way. It didn't. The families controlled the ports. Frank flew to Thailand. The families cut the product. Frank brought it pure. The families sold through intermediaries. Frank built his own distribution. The families called the shots. Frank shot on 116th Street and then finished his lunch. Step by step, decision by decision, with the patience that Bumpy had taught, and the audacity that Frank had always had, and the specific intelligence that a decade of the best available education in how power actually works had produced. Frank Lucas built something that the most powerful men in his world looked at and decided they had no choice but to respect. Carlo Gambino called Frank Lucas nobody. Not in those words, not explicitly, but in the years before September 1968, in the way that the Italian families regarded Harlem's black operators, in the structure of tributary relationships that extracted maximum value while according minimum status, in the assumption that the supply chain would always flow upward to the families and the operators below would always be dependent. That was the implicit verdict. Nobody. Frank Lucas did not argue with the verdict. He did not protest it or demand acknowledgement or seek the kind of validation that men who are performing their power need from the people around them. He went to Thailand. He came back with Blue Magic. He built a supply chain that made the families' structural advantage irrelevant in the specific market where he operated. He established a brand that reorganized the Harlem narcotics market around itself. He crossed 116th Street on September 12th and showed the world what he was. And Carlo Gambino looked at all of it and said, "That man is a professional," which was the only acknowledgement that mattered. Not because Frank needed it. He didn't. In the way that men who are genuinely certain of themselves don't need external confirmation. but because it was the most powerful man in organized crime in the United States saying, in a private room to the other four most powerful men in organized crime, that the thing Frank Lucas had built could not be ignored and would not be destroyed and deserved to be called what it was. Blue magic was the reason. Not the only reason, but the foundational one. The supply chain that no one else had built. The product that no one else could match. The brand that made itself. The economic position so strong that political power had to follow it. Frank Lucas went to Thailand because he looked at a system everybody else accepted and asked one question. He asked, why? Why does it have to work this way? Why does the product have to pass through 5 sets of hands before it reaches Harlem? Why does every dollar earned in Harlem have to flow up to families that regard the people earning it as expendable? Why is the supply chain a fact of nature rather than an arrangement that could be built differently? The answer was, it doesn't have to. It just hadn't been done differently yet. Frank Lucas did it differently, and the entire structure of New York's narcotics trade reorganized itself around the fact that he had. That is blue magic. Not just a product. Not just a brand. The answer to a question that nobody else in Harlem had thought to ask, and the beginning of the 7 years that made Carlo Gambino revise his assessment of who Frank Lucas was and what he deserved to be called. The question was, why does it have to work this way? The answer was, blue magic, and Harlem was never the same dot to fully understand what Frank Lucas built with blue magic. You have to understand the specific conditions of the American heroin market in 1968 and why those conditions made what he did both possible and unprecedented. The late 1960s in the United States were a period of extraordinary heroin consumption growth. The Vietnam War was producing a generation of young men who had been introduced to the drug in Southeast Asia, where heroin was cheap, available, and used widely by American military personnel as a way of managing the specific psychological and physical demands of a war that was going badly, and that most of the men fighting it did not fully understand why they were fighting. Soldiers who came home from Vietnam came home with habits. Those habits needed to be serviced. The existing supply chain in American cities controlled, in New York, by the Italian families was stretched by the increased demand and was not well positioned to dramatically increase supply, because the supply chain itself was complicated and slow-moving and dependent on relationships that could not be built overnight. Into this specific market condition, Frank Lucas introduced blue magic, not just a better product, a dramatically better product available in volume, through a distribution network that he had been building for months, and that was staffed by people, primarily his brothers and their networks in Harlem, who understood both the product and the market. The timing was as important as the quality. Frank was not entering a saturated market where blue magic would have to displace entrenched competitors through sheer superior quality alone. He was entering an expanding market where demand was outrunning supply, where customers were actively looking for better product, where the existing supply chain was straining to keep up. Blue magic arrived at exactly the right moment to capture a market that was in the process of forming around it. This is what great strategic timing looks like, not just doing the right thing, but doing it when the conditions are maximally favorable for it to succeed. Frank Lucas understood timing because Bumpy Johnson had spent years teaching him that patience and timing are not different things, but the same thing. The discipline to wait until the moment is right, and then to move with complete decisiveness. The result was not gradual. Blue magic did not slowly build market share over months as customers tentatively tried it and gradually preferred it. It moved through Harlem's market the way that genuinely superior products move through markets that have been starved of quality rapidly. with the specific energy of people who have found something they had not known they were looking for, and who cannot stop telling other people about it. Within weeks, the brand was established. Within months, the distribution network was running at a scale that Frank had not initially anticipated would be possible so quickly. The economics were working better than any projection Frank might have made. The combination of lower cost at the source, higher purity at point of sale, and demand that was growing rather than contracting produced margins that were, by any standard of business analysis, extraordinary. $1 million a day was not Frank's target. It was the outcome of building something right in conditions that rewarded it. The organizational demands of running an operation at that scale were considerable. Frank was not just a visionary. He was also, by necessity, an operational manager of unusual capability. He had to maintain the supply chain from Thailand to New York, which required managing relationships across multiple countries and multiple layers of the distribution system, each of which presented its own logistical and security challenges. He had to manage the domestic distribution network, the brothers, the lieutenants, the street-level operators, in a way that maintained quality control and operational security across a geography that spanned multiple boroughs of New York City. He had to manage the financial flows, the incoming revenue, the outgoing payments to supply chain partners and distributors, and the corrupt law enforcement officers who provided protection, and the laundering of cash at a scale that few criminal operations in American history had ever needed to manage. Frank did all of this with the organizational discipline and the attention to operational detail that characterized everything he had learned from watching Bumpy Johnson operate. He was not just the visionary who had seen the structural opportunity and gone to Thailand to exploit it. He was the manager who built and maintained the systems that turned that vision into a 7-year empire. His brothers were the operational backbone of the distribution side. Richie, Huey, Turner, and the others who had come up from North Carolina at Frank's request to run territories that Frank trusted only to family. This was another Bumpy teaching. The people you can trust completely are the people you grew up with, the people whose loyalty is not conditional on your current success. Frank's brothers were not the most sophisticated operators in the narcotics trade, but they were absolutely loyal to Frank in a way that the hired lieutenants who staffed most large criminal organizations could not be counted on to be. And in a business where the penalty for betrayal was typically fatal, loyalty that was not contingent on calculation was worth more than any amount of operational sophistication. The corrupt law enforcement relationships were perhaps the most delicate operational element of what Frank managed. New York in the late 1960s and early 1970s had a police department that was deeply, structurally corrupt, not just individual officers who could be bought, but entire units whose relationship to the narcotics trade was essentially institutional. Frank Lucas did not create this corruption. It existed before he arrived and would exist after he left. What Frank did was navigate it with the same strategic intelligence he applied to everything else, identifying the specific officers and units whose cooperation was most valuable, establishing payment relationships that made that cooperation reliable, and managing those relationships with the same discretion and organizational care that he applied to every other element of the operation. When Frank eventually cooperated with federal authorities after his 1975 arrest, the information he provided about law enforcement corruption was so extensive and so specific that it resulted in convictions for more than 100 officers and agents. This is the scale of what he had managed. Not a few corrupt cops on the payroll, but a systematic relationship with law enforcement corruption so deep that when it was finally exposed, it reshaped the institutional culture of the New York Police Department in ways that are still being processed decades later. Blue magic made all of this possible. Not directly, the supply chain and the distribution network and the law enforcement, Relationships were organizational achievements that required capability beyond just having a superior product. But foundationally, because Blue Magic generated the revenue that funded everything else. $1 million a day is what you can do when you control a product that has no real competition, sell it in a market where demand is growing, and operate a supply chain that removes the tribute payments that your competitors must make to the families at every stage. That revenue is what bought the protection, maintained the network, funded the brothers' territories, and allowed Frank Lucas to build the kind of operational infrastructure that a 7-year empire requires. Without Blue Magic, without the insight that sent Frank to Thailand, without the relationship with the Golden Triangle source, without the 98% purity that made the brand, none of the rest of it is possible at the same scale. The shooting on 116th Street is the announcement. The Niagara recorder is the masterstroke. The Vietnam coffins are the audacity. But Blue Magic is the foundation. It is the thing that made Frank Lucas's empire not just impressive, but structurally unprecedented. Not a larger version of what had come before, but something genuinely new in the history of the American narcotics trade. Something that required rethinking from first principles, the way that the business worked and who was allowed to be at the top of it. Frank Lucas rethought it. He asked the question nobody else was asking. He went to Thailand and got the answer. He brought it back to Harlem and called it Blue Magic. And Carlo Gambino, the most powerful man in organized crime in the United States, looked at what Frank had built and could think of nothing more accurate to say than, "That man is a professional," which was the truth, stated as simply as it could be stated by the man most qualified to recognize it. Now, if you want to understand how Blue Magic moved from Harlem to the rest of the country, and how Frank Lucas eventually found a logistics solution so audacious that the D refused to believe it was real until they had no choice, subscribe right now. Next week, the Vietnam coffin operation, the supply chain that used the most sacred transportation channel in American military history to move heroin across the Pacific. The operation that Frank Lucas built in the years when Blue Magic's demand outgrew even Thailand's capacity to supply through conventional channels. Turn on notifications. Drop a comment. Was Blue Magic the greatest business innovation in the history of the American drug trade? Because the case for yes is stronger than most people realize. The real story is always darker than you think. And it always starts with a question that nobody else thought to ask. There is one more dimension of Blue Magic that most tellings of the Frank Lucas story completely miss. And it is perhaps the most important one for understanding why what he built was different not just in scale, but in kind from what had come before. Frank Lucas understood branding before most people in his world had a word for it. He understood that a product is not just a product, that what customers buy is not simply the physical thing itself, but the meaning that attaches to it, the reputation that precedes it, the specific expectation that the name creates before the product is even in their hands. Blue Magic was not just a name Frank gave his heroine. It was a brand promise, a guarantee of quality so consistent that the name itself functioned as a quality assurance signal in a market where quality assurance had never previously existed at any meaningful level. Before Blue Magic, Harlem's narcotics consumers had no reliable way of knowing what they were getting. Product purity varied enormously, depending on who had sold it and how many times it had been cut and under what conditions. The experience of using heroin in Harlem before Frank Lucas was an experience of fundamental unpredictability. You might get product that was 40% pure, or 25%, or 15%, and you had no reliable way of knowing in advance which you were getting. Frank Lucas solved this problem, not as a matter of consumer welfare. That is not the framing in which the decision was made, but as a matter of business. A customer who knows exactly what they are getting, who can predict the experience with reliability, who has learned through repeated experience that a specific name means a specific quality, is a customer who asks for that name specifically and who is reluctant to accept substitutes. Brand loyalty in the narcotics market is more powerful than brand loyalty in almost any other market, because the product addresses a physiological need rather than a preference, and because the consequences of the product failing to deliver what the customer expects are more severe and more immediate than in almost any other category. Frank understood this. He maintained the quality of Blue Magic with a discipline that most operators in his market would have found economically irrational. There is always pressure in any business that sells a product through a distribution chain to cut quality at the margins to improve short-term margins. Frank resisted this pressure completely. The product that reached the customer was the same product that left the source, at the same purity, every time. This consistency was not achieved by accident. It required active management of every stage of the distribution chain, monitoring the product at each handoff, enforcing quality standards with consequences severe enough that distributors, who were tempted to cut the product, understood that the cost of doing so was catastrophically higher than any margin they might gain. Frank's reputation for this enforcement was part of what made the brand work. Everyone in the distribution chain knew that Frank Lucas tracked the quality of Blue Magic from source to street, and that deviations from standard were not tolerated. This created a quality control system that operated through the incentive structure of people who were afraid of what happened if they were caught cheating, which is the most reliable quality control system available in a business that cannot use legal mechanisms to enforce standards. The brand worked. Blue Magic was, in its specific category, the strongest brand in New York in the late 1960s and early 1970s, not despite the fact that it operated entirely outside the law, but in part because operating outside the law removed certain constraints on how the brand could be built and maintained. There was no regulatory approval required, no advertising standards to comply with, no distribution agreements to negotiate with retailers who had their own interests. Frank controlled the entire brand experience from source to customer, and he used that control to build something that his competitors could not replicate, even when they understood what he had built. The competitors understood the brand. They could see the effect it was having on the market. They could watch their customers leave for Blue Magic and understand that the reason those customers were leaving was that the product was better. What they could not do was replicate the product, because replicating the product required replicating the supply chain. And replicating the supply chain required doing what Frank had done, going to Thailand, building direct relationships with the Golden Triangle source, establishing the logistics infrastructure to move product from Southeast Asia to New York at scale and at purity. And none of them could do that, not because they lacked the will, but because they lacked the specific combination of network, resources, knowledge, and audacity that Frank had assembled over a decade of being exactly who he was in exactly the world he was in. Frank Lucas was the right person, in the right place, at the right time, with the right understanding of the structural opportunity. That is the description of every genuinely transformative business move in history, criminal or otherwise. The right person, the right place, the right time, the right understanding. Frank had all four. Blue Magic was the result. And the result was 7 years of an empire that generated more revenue than most legitimate corporations of its era, that employed hundreds of people directly and thousands indirectly, that reorganized the economics of Harlem's underground economy in ways that are still visible in the structures of the narcotics trade decades later, and that eventually produced, through Frank's cooperation with authorities after his arrest, one of the most significant anti-corruption prosecutions in the history of American law enforcement. The corruption that Blue Magic funded the officers and agents on Frank's payroll, was the corruption that Frank Lucas eventually helped destroy. There is a specific irony in this that Frank himself acknowledged in later interviews. He built the most sophisticated and most profitable narcotics operation in the city's history. He funded, through the payments that operation made to corrupt officials, a level of law enforcement corruption that pervaded the institutional culture of the NYPD and then, after his arrest, he provided the information that put more than 100 of those officials in prison. He created the corruption and he dismantled it. He was the problem and the solution simultaneously. Whether this represents some form of ultimate justice, or simply the pragmatic decisions of a man navigating the legal consequences of his choices with the same strategic intelligence he had applied to everything else, is a question that different people answer differently, depending on what they bring to it. Frank himself, in his later years, was relatively clear-eyed about it. He had done what he had done. The reasons were the reasons: the poverty, the exclusion, the structural abandonment of the communities that produced him, and that his operations simultaneously served and harmed. He was not naive about the harm. He was also not naive about the system that had made the harm not just possible, but in certain respects inevitable. What he had built with Blue Magic was the most complete expression of his capabilities in the context available to him. It was brilliant, and it was destructive, and it was, in the specific way that things that are both brilliant and destructive tend to be unforgettable. Carlo Gambino called Frank Lucas a professional. He was right. He was also, though he could not have known it at the time, identifying only the surface of what Frank Lucas was. Underneath the professionalism was the insight, the Thailand trip, the golden triangle relationship, the 98% purity, the brand. Underneath the brand was the strategy. Underneath the strategy was the education. A decade at Bumpy Johnson's side, learning how power actually works and how the men who last are different from the men who don't. And underneath all of it was the question, the simple, devastating, foundational question that Frank Lucas asked while sitting in his office in Harlem in July 1968, while the city's underworld was still figuring out what Bumpy Johnson's death meant. Why does it have to work this way? It didn't. Blue Magic was the proof. Men who came after Frank Lucas, the operators, who looked at what he had, built and tried to understand it, and in some cases tried to replicate it, consistently identified Blue Magic as the element of his operation that was most difficult to understand from the outside. Not because the concept was complicated. Going to the source directly, cutting out the middlemen, bringing higher quality product at lower cost. These are not ideas that require a genius to conceive. They are ideas that require a specific combination of courage, network, resources, and timing to execute. What the men who came after Frank struggled to understand was how he had assembled that specific combination at that specific moment in that specific place. The answer, as with most things about Frank Lucas, went back to Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had spent 40 years building relationships, not just in Harlem, not just in New York, but across the landscape of the world that a man of his position and his particular history touched, the specific nodes of connection that a decade of being the most important figure in Harlem's underground economy had produced. Military contacts from the war years, diaspora connections through the Caribbean networks that ran through Harlem's social infrastructure, business relationships developed through the numbers operation and the other legitimate and semi-legitimate enterprises that Bumpy maintained. Frank had been present for the building of many of these relationships. He had been the driver, the right hand, the errand boy who sat in meetings and listened and absorbed. He had understood things that Bumpy had not explicitly taught him, because Bumpy had trusted him to be in the room and to understand what he was seeing. Among the things Frank had understood were the pathways that potentially led to Southeast Asia, the specific connections, through military contacts and diaspora networks. That made direct sourcing in Thailand not just theoretically possible, but practically achievable. This was the specific knowledge that made Frank Lucas uniquely positioned to do what he did. Not just the audacity to try it, but knowledge of how to start. That knowledge came from Bumpy Johnson, not as an explicit instruction. Go to Thailand, here are the contacts, here is what you say, but as the accumulated result of a decade of proximity to a man who understood the full geography of his world and who had included Frank in enough of that geography that Frank had developed his own map of it. When Frank sat in his office in July 1968 and asked why the supply chain had to work the way it worked, the answer he found was not a blank. It was a network of possibilities that a decade of watching Bumpy had made visible. That is the deepest truth about blue magic. Not just that Frank Lucas went to Thailand and came back with 98% pure heroin. Not just that he built a brand that reorganized Harlem's narcotics market. Not just that he generated $1 million a day for 7 years, and in doing so, built the most profitable criminal enterprise in the history of New York City. The deepest truth is that all of it, every element of it, from the Thailand trip to the brand name to the quality control to the distribution network, was the product of an education that had been completed. In its final form, in the last minutes at Wells Restaurant on the evening of July 7, 1968, Blue Magic was Bumpy Johnson's final lesson. Not because Bumpy planned it that way. He died before Frank went to Thailand, before Blue Magic existed, before any of it was real. But because the education Bumpy gave Frank was the education that made Blue Magic possible. The decade of watching and learning and absorbing. The philosophy of power that prioritized patience over action and calculation over reaction. The network of relationships that pointed toward possibilities. The specific quality of certainty that Bumpy completed in his final minutes. The permission to be fully what Frank already was. Without all of that, Frank Lucas goes to Thailand and fails, or doesn't go at all, or goes and comes back with something ordinary, or comes back with something excellent, and doesn't know how to build the brand or the distribution or the protection that turns an excellent product into a 7-year empire. With all of it, Frank Lucas goes to Thailand and comes back with Blue Magic and changes the history of Harlem and the history of the American narcotics trade, and gives Carlo Gambino reason to say, in a private room, that he is a professional. Bumpy Johnson never knew about Blue Magic. He died 3 weeks before Frank left for Thailand. He never heard the name. He never saw what it became. He never knew that the education he had spent a decade giving, the patient, indirect, proximity-based education of a master who trusted his student to understand what he was watching, had produced, as its most visible and most consequential result, a brand of heroin so pure and so well marketed that it restructured the economics of the most profitable illegal market in the most important city in the world. He never knew. But the people who did know, the people who watched what Frank built in the years after Wells Restaurant, who saw Blue Magic appear and spread and dominate, who witnessed the empire that Frank Lucas constructed on the foundation of one supply chain insight and one Thailand trip, those people understood, if they thought carefully about it, that what they were seeing was the final expression of something that had been building for years. They were seeing Bumpy Johnson's student become what Bumpy Johnson had spent years making him ready to become. They were seeing the answer to the question that Bumpy had been preparing Frank to ask. They were seeing Blue Magic, and Harlem was never the same. That is Blue Magic. That is the real story behind the name that reorganized Harlem. That is what Carlo Gambino was actually acknowledging when he called Frank Lucas a professional. Not just the man who shot tango in broad daylight, but the man who had the strategic intelligence and the organizational capability to build something. That made the shooting necessary as an announcement rather than sufficient as an achievement. The shooting said who Frank was. Blue magic was what he had, and what he had was unprecedented. Subscribe now if this story showed you something you didn't know. Because next week, we go inside the Vietnam coffin operation, the logistics infrastructure that Frank built when Blue Magic's demand outgrew even the Thailand supply chain. The operation that used the most protected transportation channel in American military history. The story the D refused to believe until they opened the caskets. Turn on notifications. That story makes this one look like the beginning, which is exactly what it is.